Are you ready to take your first steps towards financial freedom by investing in property? Whether you're a first-time investor or you've started your portfolio but need some help continuing to grow, 2022 REB Buyers Agent of the Year and Rising Star finalist Lachlan Vidler and his team at Atlas Property Group are here to help. As experts in property investment, Lachlan and his team are ready to help you take your next step in growing your portfolio. By completing the research, sourcing and negotiations, Lachlan goes the extra mile to find you a high-performing investment property. Visit atlaspropertygroup.com.au to book in your discovery call absolutely free of charge.
This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
G'day, how you going? Phil Tarrant, host of the Smart Property Investment Show. Hope you're well. Been chatting about it for a long time, the last few months as we were gearing up to the federal election that took place on the 21st of May. And I'm not sure if you saw it. I did a number of different live streams through the course of the evening after the polls closed, 6 o'clock, and obviously a little bit later there in WA, who's a few hours behind us, chatting with Tom Panos, who many of you may know. For those of you who don't know, Tom is a real estate coach, auctioneer, one of the sort of more significant influencers and personalities inside of real estate in Australia. Myself and Tom do a regular weekly real estate exposure where we go behind the scenes in real estate. So we thought we'd do a nice election special and give our thoughts and perceptions live on air as the votes started coming in. We sort of did a number of them over the course of the evening. Go back and watch them if you want. As we sort of pivoted from those early indicators with the Libs looking pretty good into where it ended up with the coalition government now in opposition and Anthony Albanese, our new Prime Minister. Congratulations from all the team here at Momentum to the Labor Party, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and no doubt we could probably get him to come and have a chat with us at some point, tell us what his views are on property. So there is a change in government, and we're all pretty familiar. We've been chatting about it on this show, but also it's a lot of coverage that running up into the election, and one of the reasons why potentially they weren't successful in the election prior was some of those policies they're putting out towards real estate, particularly property investments. So they were pretty clear that they weren't going to tinker or move on negative gearing and capital gains tax, 50% discounts on it. And I think that may have helped sway some voters into the Labor camp. But there's a whole bunch of other policies that they put up in those last couple of weeks to the election, as the then coalition government did as well. It turned very quickly into a property election. A lot of the headline policies of both parties were around property. And I was chatting sort of 2 months beforehand saying, there's not a lot of property stuff coming out of this. I don't think it's going to be a property election. So I think in many ways it come into that because property pulls at the heartstrings of all Australians, and it's something that's very visible, something that's very emotive, and it's something that every Australian, irrespective of how they become an Australian, whether they're born here or they've chosen to call Australia home, it's part of our DNA. And no doubt that was one of the catalysts behind both parties driving forward with property-orientated agendas. I want to get into today. What does it mean? What does the results of this election mean for property investors? And this is a podcast for property investors, which is cool. I like doing it. And today I'm joined by my colleague at Momentum, our editor of real estate, Grace Ormsby. We're going to get into this, try and work out what it all means, whether it means anything at all, and what we should be doing as a result of it. Grace, how are you going?
Yeah, I'm good. It's always cool when we get to do one of these together. Probably, I mean, we're both busy people, but it's fair to say we probably don't do this enough / as much as we should be doing. But it's always cool to be unpacking these kind of things with you, Phil. Yeah,
well, that's one thing that we can fix immediately, right? We've already started doing it. So I expect to hear more from myself and Grace. And a lot of you will know Grace. She does a lot of work across realestatebusiness.com.au, which is our big platform for the real estate sector, those people who do real estate as a profession, and it's intrinsically linked with property markets. Myself and Grace work very closely on real estate right across Momentum, and in many ways, Momentum has some of the biggest brands in real estate, sort of keeping people informed and engaged, helping to make more informed investment decisions at least, but also on the business side where Grace spends a lot of her energies and effort highly engaged in with real estate. So expect to hear more from us as we break these things down. get stuck in. And also some of our journos. And there's a really good piece, Grace, on smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, written by a couple of journos, a shared byline for these significant stories in our team, Juliet Hemke and Kyle Robbins. Really good piece, come out of the blocks on the day of the election going, okay, this is what's happened. Australia has voted. Looking forward, here are the policies that property purchasers, homeowners, investors can expect from the next government. So we probably should chat through that, because some people are probably going, yeah, I sort of get it, but I'm not too sure what it all means. But before we go, we're going to go to a break. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to get into that when we come back in a moment.
Ever wondered how you can invest like the top 1% of Australian property investors? Henderson Advocacy has been at the forefront of helping everyday Aussies improve their financial freedom. So if you're a savvy investor or someone just starting out on their property journey, give Henderson Advocacy a call today. Head to www.henderson.com.au. Don't invest alone. Invest smarter.
Welcome back, everyone. Phil Tarrant here, host of Smart Property Investment Show, joined by my colleague Grace Ormsby, editor of Real Estate at Momentum. Now, Grace, where did you watch the election? Did you watch the election? Did you go to a fancy election party somewhere and drinking fine wines and canapes? I was, as I mentioned beforehand, I was drinking a cheap glass of Chardonnay, chatting with Tom Panos over Zoom and Facebook Lives. Where did you watch the election?
I was in my own living room.
Oh.
I had been out earlier in the evening, but it kind of got to the pointy end. I was actually at a bit of a family event and we all ended up just glued to the TV. It was interesting watching it play out, because for a while it was quite, as you well know, we didn't know which way it was going to go. And then around 9 o'clock, it was like, okay, I think that Labor has got this. It looks like that's the path forward, but it was still a little bit all over the place.
It was a bit all over the place. It's when those Western Australia votes really started coming in that everyone, oh, hey, hang on.
Yeah.
Things are changing.
Very interesting. I think obviously it's still playing out some of the discourse from earlier in COVID-19 and the pandemic, and Mark McGowan's decision to keep those borders closed. And that became a political issue for the Liberal coalition. And it seems to be some of the comments that have been made that was some of the discourse that did really sink the Liberals over there, especially. I mean, it is interesting even that, because we do always hear that state and national elections do go the opposite way, and that clearly hasn't been the case here. So definitely an interesting election. I don't think anyone quite, not that anyone knew what the outcome was going to be pre-election, but, even the way that it did go was still quite interesting and is probably one for the history books.
Yeah, I really enjoyed watching it play out, and I can be a bit of a political and election nerd when the time's right. It doesn't sort of consume my whole life, but I sort of like to keep largely connected, and a lot of the work I do at Momentum puts me in connection with a lot of the ministers. So it's good to see this. And it was like, Grace, it was like, I think about 2,000 different candidates up for election. I can't remember the exact numbers. I think there's about 421 for the Senate, and by memory, there's about 1,600 candidates for the House of Representatives. So there's 2,000 people, committed Australians, who put their hands up saying, hey, I want to participate. I want to, be some sort of community champion and put my hand up for politics. So there was a lot of people who didn't win on Saturday night. And there's a lot of people, we need to remember that. And I spoke about this with Tom, giving some sense to it, saying, hey, like, I know a fair few politicians, and politicians, if you look at it's just quite funny. We should really talk about this. You look at the most or the least trusted professions, politicians, journalists, and real estate agents.
We've got all three in one podcast, haven't we?
All three.
Gosh, no one's going to listen to this.
No one's going to listen to this. I know a lot of politicians, and they really give up a lot to do what they do. People think they got a cushy job and they get a big salary, and irrespective of where you sit in politics, it's irrelevant. But they cop a bad rap. But, a lot of them, by and large, are highly committed people who are passionate about what they do for a living, and they give up a lot in order to serve their communities. And, win or lose, I think we should really be acknowledging that, because it's a tough gig and it's not for everyone. And, we've got to change the team now, and there'll be a lot of people trying to go, oh, yeah, what do I do? My first day at the job. We saw the new leader, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong, they were straight up the next day up to Tokyo for the
Japan,
quad discussions. And I think everyone was happy that the US President Joe Biden remembered, or actually knew Albanese by name rather than that bloke from down under. So mate, at least we're off on the right foot. But people, election night is cool. My story, I voted in a little regional area, Grace, as a vote. Okay, what do you call it?
Absentee voter.
Absentee vote, and it just reminded me, sort of knocking around a little bit about politics, and sort of knowing a bit about it. It just reminded me that most Australians don't care. Because I think we're one out of, I can't remember the stat, maybe 1 in 10 democracies
that compulsory voting.
Compulsory to vote. It's, I can't remember the number, but it's compulsory. Most people, I was standing there, people going, "Oh, look, just give me the forms. I don't care. Here, just tick my name off. I don't want the forms. I don't care who's in power. I don't want to vote. Just tick my name off so I don't get a fine." It just was a sage reminder to me that a lot of people don't really care.
Yeah.
Just want to get on with life.
It was even interesting. I probably had a bit of a different experience to you in that I voted out at West Ryde Public School. So opposite of a little country town, but the line was huge. And I was actually an absentee voter there too. So I did manage to skip a few minutes doing that. But interestingly enough, the New South Wales Premier, Dominic Perrottet, was there surrounded by a security detail.
Oh, he rocked up the vote the same place you did.
Well, I don't know if he was voting there, but he was trying to drum up some support for his colleagues in the federal election.
Wow.
Bit of an interesting approach, I thought, to have 4 security guards all suited up and a few police members there too. The lady behind me was like, "Is that the mayor?" I was like, "No."
Bit of theatre, never.
Yeah.
Does he live out that way? I don't know.
He's in the Epping area.
Yeah, okay.
Obviously, those electorates are slightly different, but it obviously falls under his, I guess, control to that extent. Of that.
To be fair, though, and this was probably my great takeaway from the election is that they're obviously selling democracy sausages on election day at this. There's a little school, regional area of New South Wales, and the menu, what they were actually offering on this schoolyard menu for the classic take of the democracy sausage, you could get a full burger with bacon and sausage and everything you could possibly imagine and all the trimmings and absolutely everything for $4. I was like, yes.
Yeah. That sounds better than what I had on offer, but I did love the signs that were up. They had the biggest decision you're going to be making this election day, onion or no onion. And then if you're sick of the election, don't worry, the democracy sausage has you covered. So
democracy sausage. And people are just going, just get on with what this means around property, Grace. So look, let's remember, we're talking about the sausage sandwich of the great Australian, much like the great Australian dream, Grace, which is property ownership. The great Australian election must-eat is the democracy sausage. But to be fair, the election, what does it mean for property investors? I think it's more second and third order effects, the election, rather than, and I haven't really sort of thought of it in this way, but it's more second and third and fourth order effects rather than the immediate, the first order effects. And first order effects would be they've removed negative gearing or they've changed capital gains tax breaks or other significant property taxes. And we'll leave the whole sort of stamp duty discussion for a little bit later, which is a state-based tax. So first order effects, not a massive amount for property investors. However, second and third order effects for property investors, I think, are very significant when you consider some of the new governments, the Labor government's policies, particularly, Grace, around help to buy. Can you give us a quick insight into what's all that about?
Yeah, so Help to Buy was one of the most recent policies that they actually brought out, and it's probably worth noting that in rebuttal, I suppose, the Liberal government did bring out their super scheme to buy, kind of as a direct comparison to that. So no matter who sort of won the election, there was going to be this additional scheme that came out adjacent to the new home guarantee 5% deposit scheme that was already in operation and on the cusp of being expanded. But with this Help to Buy scheme, they've pledged that mortgages could be cut by up to $380,000. That's obviously on the very extreme end of the scales being used, but the government will provide equity contributions of up to 40% for the purchase price of a new home and up to 30% for the purchase price of an existing home, with people, able to do that with a deposit as little as 2% or 5%, depending on their circumstances. So really that's going to see, and 10,000 places are available for that. So
is that per year? 10,000 a year, is it?
I'd say it would be. Yeah, I don't think we exactly
got that
a lot
of details on these. These were just election promises. So everyone goes, oh, that's great. And now there's this bit that happens after it where someone's actually got to go and really work out what it all means. So that's where we're in right now.
But yeah, so 10,000 of those places, I feel like it, sits in comparison to the guarantees that we've already seen come on offer. But I guess that it is worth pointing out that there's been some criticisms around, how this is going to work. And as we've just said, we don't exactly have all the details. It is a scheme that has been used previously. The Victorian government actually has their own scheme at the moment to do something similar, where they'll buy out, they'll allow people to buy a home and just put in some of that equity to make it easier for people to actually jump on the property ladder. So it's worth noting that it is a demand side stimulus. Maybe stimulus is the wrong word, but an initiative to help on the demand side and help ease the burdens of that cost, which, there's been a lot talked about affordability and people saying that anything that does come onto that supply side is just going to have the effect of pushing up prices. CoreLogic has brought out some analysis on it, sort of flagging that, but also noting that 10,000 places probably isn't enough to artificially inflate those prices too much. So it is an interesting one. There's obviously a bit of a give and a take with that, as there is with any new policy that does come in when it comes to housing. And just worth noting that will sit alongside an expanded new home guarantee, first home loan deposit scheme expansion, which will also include those regional places. So that was it in a bit of a nutshell. But
and
a lot
we'll
there.
get some more detail. But by the way, I don't know if you know this for our listeners, but Anthony Albanese is actually a property investor. He's got some properties that he rents out. And I read a story about how he sort of dropped the rent for one of his tenants through COVID and never put it back up, and how he was a great guy as a result of it. So maybe we can get him in.
We've got to try, don't we?
His property investment portfolio, and it goes to show that property investment is open and available to anyone in Australia. If you earn income, whether you're the Prime Minister or you're driving a forklift out in the western suburbs of Sydney, property is something which is a great enabler for wealth creation. So these are the stories we'd like to tell on smartpropertyinvestment.com. But Grace, you mentioned 40% equity contribution, and I was sitting there just thinking that's a lot of money, right? So we need the details around the size of the property you can buy, and it's going to be different because prices in Adelaide are very different to prices in Sydney. And these are all the details that still need to come out in the wash. But they're saying they do 40% for a new home and 30% for an existing home. So there's a couple of things that says to me at a more macro level that the Australian government, the Labor government, and the Liberal government was largely implying the same things, but they're going about it a different way, are investing in Australian real estate. And that gives you sense as a property investor of the asset class by this particular policy. And some people are going to argue against me on this, and there'll be economists out there saying, it's not the way it works. But, at face value, if the Australian government is investing in real estate and investing in the value of real estate and helping Australians to get into real estate, they're highly connected in the inherent value of real estate in Australia. The last thing the government's going to want is prices to go backwards, because essentially they're going to be putting maybe these new homeowners, these borrowers, into negative equity. And that's the case. So the government goes into negative equity as well, right? They're not going to be able to get their money back. So at a macro level, that's the reality of it. And we'll probably need to get someone who's a lot smarter than us to really talk about the economic mechanics of that. But at a face value, the Australian government is backing real estate. That's a good thing. And it's sort of a layer under that and give you some sense for it. If it's a new home, 40%. If it's an existing home, 30%. So the government is going, we'd rather people buy new homes. And what does new homes mean? New homes mean houses need to get built. And so a big part of the affordability equation is the fact that there's not enough homes in Australia right now. We're undersupply as it is. We want to keep growing the nation economically, population and stuff. We need to build more stuff. So rather than people transacting on existing properties, they want to stimulate the building of new homes, right? And if you get more building, that's a good thing, because that means more people are employed. And when you think about the traditional heartland of the Labor Party is normally the inverted commas, more working class aspects of society rather than more knowledge-centered economy. So we're talking about all the building trades. When you look at, the big union movement, which the Labor government is highly connected in with, that is building, construction and manufacturing. So if they can create at a demand side, people wanting new houses, that means stuff's getting built like plasterboard and wood and metal
Bricks.
and nails and all that sort of stuff. And it means people are going to be employed because there's a demand for the services. So this is how different parts of the economy all sort of come together to work in a particular way. Now, those two things are probably good for Australia, but what does it mean for property investors? Well, number one, Australian government is committed to investing in real estate at a particular level. Number two, hopefully we can get more building happening, which is going to stimulate trade. Let's not even talk about supply chain challenges at the moment, which are with us. Like, good luck trying to get a builder at the moment. Good luck trying to get some building materials. That will slowly change over time, but it's going to take some time. We import, Grace, a lot of wood from Russia, a lot of paper from Russia. And at the moment, with those sanctions as a result of the war in Ukraine, that's not all happening. So this ain't going to go away at any point soon, but hence the reason why the new government has announced another focus on advanced manufacturing in Australia and trying to get that back. Again, a heartland of the Australian voter. But what does it all mean for property investors? Well, there should be, particularly at the area, and this is the intersection between where most investors operate and most first home owners operate, they typically compete for the same properties, or they're buying similar price properties in similar areas. So at a particular sector of the market, there's going to be ongoing demand for those assets, which should inversely ensure that there is the continued upwards pressure on prices or the value of those properties. So that's good for property investors, right? That's good for property investors. But you mentioned Tim Lawless there says that 10,000 places wouldn't necessarily overinflate those markets.
No, which I did think was interesting coming from him. He's obviously done a lot of research and, very entrenched in
he's a bright guy.
Economy.
He's got a lot of data at his hand.
Yeah, knows what's going on. But I guess it just speaks to how much of a supply crisis we're already in. And that gives a lot of sense as to, there's still going to be that competition for the limited amount of properties that are out there. So it will be an interesting one to watch going forward. But I think investors can be really heartened that there's not going to be that, we have already had predictions that prices would go off a cliff this year. Interest rates have already risen a bit. We've seen a 0.25% increase there. We're expecting more, but prices haven't really shifted all that much. We've seen obviously a little bit less action as well in the lead up to the election, although nothing near what we have seen previously before the 2019 election, which is again interesting because we didn't think it was going to be about property, and then it sort of turned out that it became all about property. But I guess it's probably worth noting that whatever side did come into power, whether it was Liberal or Labor, they were peddling quite similar policies. So, people were going to be protected either way when it came to their investments in property. And we've still got a national rental vacancy rate somewhere around 1%. So if that's not, a good sign for investors who are wanting to get out there onto the market, then I don't really know what is.
Yeah, and that obviously is one of the drivers of the inflation equation for Australia right now, and why they're giving 40% for new homes rather than 30% for existing, because they need more homes. Like, they need to try and get more people building homes, which is great, and a lot of people want to, but you see all these developers going bust now, and all this supply chain pressures is a huge issue, and it will be moving forward. Interestingly, to the government policy here, it says during the period of the loan grace, the home buyer is able to buy an additional stake in the property when they have the means to do so. That's cool.
It is cool.
Before that point, they will not have to pay rent for the portion of the home owned by the government. The government would recover its equity and its share of the capital gain when the house is sold. So the government's highly invested that there is capital gain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they're probably thinking, oh, wow, they're back in Australian real estate. If they go, if I've got to pony up $100,000 here to help someone into a house, and then you're going to get the inherent growth of whatever the average is for property, we'll get our money back and some, and maybe help pay off some of the sovereign debt that we have.
Yeah. I mean, I do actually think it's obviously going to be limited in its scope, and there are restrictions around the people that are able to access that scheme. But there are huge benefits in there for both the government and for the individual who does pursue that kind of thing. There's always a lot of talk, and we saw it come out recently about if people are struggling to pay rent, maybe they should just buy a home. Well, actually, this is what this scheme actually allows them to do, because it is harder to save for a deposit if you are paying rent that is higher than those mortgage repayments might be. So, yeah, I think it is a great opportunity for people, and I don't think investors need to be worried, even though there might be a little bit more competition in the short term. But it is interesting too, property investing, we always talk about that being the long game, and it does feel like that's what the government is really trying to do. Some of their policies that they've brought out, they're not necessarily going to see benefits to the Australian people in the short term, but in the long term, they'll really pay off and be good policies for that.
Yeah, and this particular policy hits a number of parts of the Australian population, also the Australian psyche. It's drawing on those emotional strings of home ownership in Australia. And myself and you, Grace, we're slightly different generations. I'm not an old person, but I'm sort of a little bit more advanced than where you are. You're in the challenge of, in your generation, you're a lot more connected in with property to get on the property ladder. And it's a challenge. My generation, most people know about what I share on the Smart Property Investment Show, my attitude towards property and moving forward. But then you look at parents who are trying to help their kids onto the property ladder. It's the parents that have most of the equity at the moment. And your millennials complaint is that the boomers hold all the wealth and they're not moving it on, and they're living longer and they're not passing it down and all that sort of stuff. So I imagine there's a lot of parents who go, and I actually spoke to a mate of mine who's a lawyer, went, I'm going to get my kids onto that straight away. He's got kids at 18, 19, 20, I think. So there's a lot of Australians who would have gone, that won't impact me, but it'll impact my kids. I'm going to get them onto that. That makes a lot of sense. So, a lot of the criticisms around the coalition, now the opposition coalition's scheme, was that it was taking money out of people's superannuation, and therefore they weren't getting the compounding growth of that super in addition to their contributions over time. And there was, the Labor government, because of its connectivity with, I guess, a lot of trade union movements and the trade unions in many ways, the keepers of, or the custodians of the large industry super funds, they didn't want to see their super fund eroded and therefore the fees associated with it. So maybe it's a good outcome. Maybe it's a good balance. We look forward to seeing how this plays out. But then the catch-all for investors is, just nothing really of significant concern around it. The big thing for most investors was the fact that negative gearing would go, and that is not the case. So let's move on with it all. There's a couple of little smaller fringe policy stuff, Grace. We'll have a chat about them. We'll just get another break. Stay with us. Back in a moment.
It's time to get help. Interest rates are increasing. Inflation has hit an extraordinary 5.1%, and the chance to secure a golden egg property is getting narrower by the day. Dragan from Buyers Agency Australia has been presenting the facts and helping property investors make smarter, well-informed, educated decisions in property for years. So what are you waiting for? Get in touch with Dragan today at www.buyersagencyaustralia.com.au. Invest with integrity.
G'day, everyone. Welcome back. Phil Tarrant, host of the Smart Property Investment Show, with my colleague, Grace Ormsby, chatting through the election. Now, Grace, a couple of other things here, which sort of policy-orientated stuff around the election, and now with the Labor government in power, a National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. So this is following calls, Grace, from the housing advocates across the country. The new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has pledged to establish a National Housing Supply and Affordability Council to address the two interrelated issues. So that's housing supply and affordability. We just spoke about that.
One side of the equation.
Yeah, the council will reportedly be composed of experts from finance, economics, urban development, residential construction, urban planning, and social housing sectors. I know they didn't put the media in there. I'd probably be getting me onto that ASAP to give a real-world sense of what's going on. The council will work closely with states and territories in setting targets for land supply in consultation with states and territories, and play a key role in developing Labor's national housing and homelessness plan. So homelessness is, again, a very different thing. It's probably outside the scope of this discussion, this podcast. However, I do note it's a significant problem for Australia, and the level of homelessness is something that all Australians are investing in improving. And it comes down to affordability. Affordability comes down to supply And that's the whole thing around housing supply and affordability. If you get the supply right, the affordability can normally work its way out. One of the biggest issues, Grace, around housing supply is the red tape and the bureaucracy to actually get new developments done, whether it's infill type developments in established areas versus more greenfield developments. It's still not easy. It takes a lot of time. It doesn't happen as fast as what it is. And you got to do it quite scientifically, because if you release too much stuff too quickly, it does stuff to the economy. If you release it too slowly and not fast enough, it does stuff to the economy. So hopefully this council gets some really bright people in there to try and work it out, who aren't just academics. And this would be my point. Just don't do the usual stuff and get academics in there. Get people who actually do this stuff for a living as well. Buyer's agents, for example, who actually know what's happening in real estate more than pretty much anyone, I believe. Grace, anything else around to fill in around this particular policy?
I think it's probably just worth noting, and we did say it's a little bit adjacent, but that is all part of sort of a $10 billion fund that's going to go to improving supply. And it does encompass the homelessness work as well. But affordable housing is actually probably worth noting, probably fits into that a little bit as well. That's some of that housing that is for those essential workers, as we've been calling them for the last couple of years through the pandemic. But it will be interesting to see. I think there could be a lot of benefits that do come out of this, even just it might be some better town planning going on. We might actually see, with that urban sprawl that is occurring, a few more hubs occurring in the outer suburbs. We're going to see, I think, a continuation of that outward spread from CBDs, but not necessarily into these sprawling, just sprawling suburbia. I think we'll see Greater Western Sydney continue to develop. Parramatta and Penrith CBDs will continue to boom. I think North Sydney CBD will continue to grow adjacent to Sydney CBD. So all of that, I think, could have an influence on where people do start spending more of their time and changing what they see as desirable and where they want to live, which I think is promising, because it's all still surrounding infrastructure that already exists. But, there's going to be some great opportunities there for investors down the track too.
And let's note also, property investors are a big part of supporting, in some ways, and about a whole bunch of people that would argue against this particular point. However, property investors do provide a great service for housing for Australians who can't afford it. There's 2.7 million investment properties in Australia. That means there's 2.7 million families who are able to have a place to live, to rent, and that means the government isn't required to provide that housing. Now, there is still social housing, and our new Prime Minister is a great story of, and he's highly connected in with it because he's lived it, coming through social housing. So he's going to be highly invested in making sure those Australians that need social housing have access to social housing. But then there is this role played by property investors who provide housing to a huge swathe of Australians. 2.7 million investment properties. How many people are living in an investment property in Australia? I don't know the actual numbers, but I'd imagine to be 5 to 6 plus million people living in investment properties in Australia. So, if you want to take one thing away from this podcast, you're supporting part of the Australian population. The issue, though, now, Grace, is that there's not enough of these properties for rent. Hence the reason why vacancy rates are sort of around that 1% mark. And that's a big issue. For property investors, it means they're putting up prices in line with demand. And that's fair enough. You are a property investor, and this is a property investment podcast. The downside of that is that it's costing Australians even more to live as a result of it. And you exacerbate that with the price of petrol and other commodities. This is the inherent driver of inflation.
Yes, definitely an interesting time when it comes to that. And I did note with a certain amount of irony that the new finance minister has come out and said it looks like we could be in a bit of a worse position than they had thought going into the election. I don't know how true it is or not, but apparently some of those figures hadn't been reported correctly or had been missed on the upcoming budget papers. It's going to be a struggle for a while yet. I can't see anything really budging those vacancy rates in the short term, which will in turn lift that inflation even more. And that is concerning for a lot of people. So without that wage growth happening, and I would say as well that while we do have record low unemployment at the moment, a lot of that is coming from underemployment. So that's what's going to need to be picking up to full employment for some of those wage numbers to actually shift.
I agree. It's intriguing when you look at this if you're a student of economics, you just have a field day with the environment that we're in right now. And, I think the outcomes of a globalized economy is much better than not having a globalized economy. But one of the downsides of globalized economy, and something which is born really out of the 80s and opening up Australia to the world, is that we are now so intrinsically reliant on global supply chains for a lot of the stuff for just daily living here in Australia. And by that, I mean foodstuffs, and for the purpose of property, building materials. It's a big issue. And look, these things will wash through, but it's going to take some time. And this is for the new government to work it all out. But Grace, I saw a story just today. I think maybe it was Real Estate Business or smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, pretty much going, is regional Australia affordable anymore?
Yeah,
it's a big thing. And one of the promises going into the election was around this regional first home guarantee, and that's the expansion of the first home guarantee. The Labor Party has promised to help 10,000 regional Australian families a year buy their first home, and this aims to triple the number of places that Australians living in regional Australia received last year under the first home FHG scheme. Grace, places will be reserved for Australians that have lived in a region in which they apply for more than 12 months. So these aren't just some city slickers trying to cash in on regional grants. It will see approved applicants purchase a home with a little 5% deposit without needing to pay lenders' mortgage insurance, or LMI. So, again, I think attracting people to the regions makes a lot of sense.
Me too.
For Australia. One thing we do have here is a lot of land, and there's some great outside of the big capital cities. And we spoke about this two-tier market. Brizzy's still firing along. Regional Australia seems to be holding firm in property prices. Sydney and Melbourne is where they get the headlines of prices coming back a bit. So this is another initiative on behalf of the new Labor government.
Yeah, I think this one is actually interesting, and it's probably a point that not many people think about. But for investors, it's actually really good because it might spur some people that have been city slickers that are looking for a different lifestyle, a bit of a change of pace. And it's going to actually push them out into the regions if they've got to be spending 12 months there before they can buy. And that's going to, in turn help the investors that are already there, because they're going to have to rent. Months. Yeah. Yep. And whether or not they do then, take up the scheme and move there permanently, that's still a really good thing for the investors who are already there, because, people are moving to the regions. In 12 months, you're going to have built up, a bit of a social circle. You're going to have gone into gainful employment. There's a lot of, as we've mentioned earlier, second and third tier effects, flow-on effects that are actually kind of exacerbated in these from a policy like this. I love it. I think it is a really great idea. We have seen affordability decrease in the regions while they are still a lot cheaper than Sydney and Melbourne. It is becoming increasingly unaffordable for the people that are already living in those areas. So if that can actually help them get onto the property ladder as well, then that can only really be a good thing.
There we go. Well, by disclaimer, we're not economists by any means. We're just a couple of journos that get by sort of talking about stuff on podcasts and writing things on websites. So just this is our views and this is our opinions. So by no means at all should you take any of this as financial advice. However, we're in a interesting and changing market, and the smartest investors I know see opportunities in every market. So you should really be embracing that mindset as you shape your investment decision-making over this period of time. Go and speak to the people that know about this and do it for a living. Yep, and these are the people you normally need to pay money to. By that, I'm meaning accountants and buyer's agents and property strategists and all those cadre of good professionals who are highly supportive of helping property investors. Quick tip, though, if you want to get involved in looking at where you can capitalize on this market, you've got to get finance ready first. So if you don't yet, or you haven't yet started that process, I'd probably get stuck into it, because that's where you need to start. And the first thing is going to ask you if they want to help you out buying property is to have you got a mortgage? I've got some really good chats coming up with some clients out of the mortgage broker, Finny Mortgages, finny.com.au. So stand by with that and they'll tell you how they're actually going about securing finance in this particular market. But Grace, I enjoy the chat. Let's do this on a more regular basis.
We need to, for sure. Thank you.
Really good. No, thank you. And thanks for all your insights and the continued great work that you and your team do serving Australia's real estate sector, the business of, but also property investors. So thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure. Anytime.
Nice one. That's Grace Ormsby, editor of Real Estate at Momentum Media. I'm Phil Tarrant. I think you all know who I am by now. And if you sort of sick of my droning voice, you'll start to hear Grace a little bit more on this podcast as well, which is probably a bit more interesting and pleasant to listen to. Remember, smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, social media, Smart Property HQ is where you'll find us. Quick favour for us, please. Myself and Grace get all the good parts of the job, that is doing the chatting, but we've got a great team behind us that do the heavy lifting in terms of the podcast producing. Please keep those reviews coming wherever you listen to this. Most of you on Apple iTunes, the team get a real kick out of it. We'll see you again next time. Until then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
It's safe to say the property market has been red hot over the last few years, with some of the markets we've selected in 2021 rising over 40% in a 12-month period. It's very likely that if you're a property owner, your property has gone up 20% minimum in value in the past 12 months, and you have most likely accrued sizable equity that can be recycled and extracted to build your investment portfolio. With interest rates increasing, you might be wondering where to invest to maximise capital growth and cash flow in 2022 and beyond. Well, to save you time, energy and guesswork, award-winning author and regular guest on the Smart Property Investment podcast, Paul Glossop and his team at Pure Property Investment have outlined the top 30 affordable suburbs poised for strong capital growth over the next few years with sound cash flow. Grab your free Top 30 Guide to Property Investment guide today at purepropertyinvestment.com.